The Joko is live. Greetings, folks. Anyone out there watching us on YouTube or Facebook, or who will be watching later? Greetings and welcome to the Joko. I am Brother Youssef.
I am Tasha.
We are happy to be with you this evening. This May Day. This International Workers' Day. Workers of the world unite.
Workers of the world unite and resist this takeover. And shame on me, I allowed myself to be immersed in work today and didn't look into festivities and see what folks are doing, because I know there were some pretty important May Day demonstrations. I know there are important May Day demonstrations planned all over the nation, all over the world.
No doubt.
There was stuff going on in California.
It seems with an even greater urgency, right?
Yeah.
Right now, with because the thing that we even haven't talked about enough, this rise of the right, or of right-wing policies around the world, and right-wing governments, particularly in the global north, is how fundamentally and militantly and intentionally anti-worker, right? Those politics are, and those class interests are, and these policies are, and that resistance to modernity, right? Part of that resistance to the more progressive aspects of modernity is just that, right? How dare these serfs think they have a voice, a vote, right? So yes, workers everywhere, more power to us all in all of our various sectors.
Yeah, and that transformative and potentially transformative. I guess it can't be transformative without being potentially transformative. But the transformative nature of that critique emerging from the culture itself, Western culture, the Western mind itself, in that, I think ever under existing very fundamental, universal human ethic for justice, recognition of justice, just treatment, etc., etc. So the profoundest critique of exploitation, profoundest, I say, hyperbole in any event. This super profound and accurate critique of the worst excesses of Western civilization emerges from the civilization itself, from the culture set itself. And before we go any further to get into that discussion, to take our customary time to acknowledge our lineages, our personal lineages, and everybody with us, taking that moment to ground and reflect, kind of situate ourselves as, as offspring, as the specific product of our parents, right? And every experience and every entity that has brought us to the point in our life path where we are um, happily conscious, fortunately conscious and aware of the push for justice, and have ever growing information stores to help us win that, be forceful in the winning of that battle, and in the push and be forceful in that and effective in that resistance. Everything that, right, makes us who we are, we bring to the table, and that's coming from within our personal lineage, and we acknowledge the collective ancestors of the African family, specifically those who have um, furthered this global and epic um, resistance to these forces, and have done so much to articulate that resistance and be effective in that resistance, and to push back against all of these kind of egregious social problems, social issues. And we get to even acknowledge that society reaches beyond human society, and that the effects of, right, these maleffects reach into the what's the other parts of the natural world. Um, we acknowledge, always bring to our forefront our minds, that the work that we're doing for African people's liberation as African people, we do it the hospitality of the First Nations people of this Turtle Island, specifically in the unceded territories and unceded lands of the Tongva and Chumash, in what has been labeled the LA Basin, and these Pacific Coast areas. Um, we always want to take the time to acknowledge that. That is our land acknowledgement. Anything we do at the hospitality of the First Nation peoples and their gracious ancestors. And that is all. Okay, we look forward tonight to launching into a discussion of culture, um, and the cultural aspects, the cultural aspect of this reactionary rightism, and this kind of uh, uh, what this draw and push um, to these values are, how they relate to the opposing set of values, um, in the realm of culture, in the realm of art, in the realm of um, expression, in the realm of all kinds of, right, generating all kinds of products of mind, of tradition, of thought. Um, and I see our good brother Yusuf is back. And as a scholar of culture, he's going to engage us in bringing some definition to what we're talking about, um, lest we be arbitrary. We can at least, right, set our sights. Right, we don't say that any definition is exhaustive, but we can at least define our terms and say these are the parameters that we're talking in. And so I pass the mic back to our dear brother Yusuf.
Yes, and thank you. And indeed, right, that I've said before, introduce myself as a professor, and culture is my area, right? The cultural studies. And culture is one of it's really a funny word, right? Just in terms of how widely it's deployed, and yet how sometimes very difficult it is to define. The The root word of cult or culture is cult. And that word by itself, has evokes particular notions of groups of people, um, except in particular circumstance, right? It's completely acceptable if you're talking about the cult of Mary, for example, or the cult of Saint Francis, and something like that. The And even that I think very useful, and as I recall, without looking at the book in front of me, this is the way Raymond Williams, the British sociologist, um, begins his discussion in his book Keywords, right? His sort of glossary, right, that he's put together, keywords. Cult or culture, right, are these things that grow, right? You think about like a biological culture. Um, we when we're eating our yogurt, right, we're eating it because of the cultures in it, and so
Mhm.
that's something to always keep in mind, right? There's this thing that is growing, right, this living thing right, that grows now, in the biological sense, right? But how it is commonly deployed, as an aspect of a society. And that generally is referring to some of the kind of material expressions of a society. It's cuisine, a group of people, right? Not even a society as such, but a group of people,
Mhm.
an identified ethnos, right, or an identified collective of people with some shared customs. Um, their cuisine, ways of dress, the various kind of performative and plastic arts they produce, um, and that's culture, right? And it's really sort of the special category of a society, of a group of people, um, that in the modern world, right, this in the modern era, right, this area of modernity is kind of compartmentalized like other parts of society, right? Just the way you go to work during the week and you go to church on Sunday, that kind of the kind of compartmentalization that's been um, is such an aspect of modernity. And culture is over there, right? Like when we break down the newspaper, right? There's the political and social news, I guess, right? And the sports news, the business news, and then the culture, right? The which is typically looking at the arts, and that's what people usually mean by culture, right? The various arts. But culture really is everything we do in a way that makes it meaningful, right? In particular ways, which is everything we do, right? As humans, as
Mhm.
animal that imbues everything with meaning in some kind of way, right? Things mean
Mhm.
more than what they are, and so all so culture is part of everything, really. It the it's so that you talked about in your comments, the kinds of thoughts, right, that are in circulation. And yeah, that's culture, right? The our frames of reference, the stories of who we are, and um, you, where we've come from, and all that, and that we relive, right? And we surround ourselves with every day in such ways that they become invisible, even. Um, how the culture, tells its story, and reinforces um, itself, or the identity, the identification of a group of
Mhm.
people,
Mhm.
and becomes the all-pervasive invisible environment, right? Because of its pervasiveness. Um, and it's one of the principal carriers of any given culture is language, right? And
Mhm.
humans are language, again, creatures, right? Language animals, language beings.
Mhm.
Um, so a universe of meaning, right? And the symbolic. The So that, that way in which culture is more than just this kind of specialized area of
Mhm.
society, the place of the artist, the folk artist, right, the fine artist, whatever, the pop artist, however we want to break that down, right? The
Mhm.
but is what informs, that those artistic activities and those kind of, those intentional artistic
Mhm.
activities, whether professionals
Mhm.
or just everyday folks who are doing arts and crafty stuff, or again just the work of the kitchen, right, and just preparing meals
Mhm.
and then
Mhm.
sharing meals, right, in a particular way, and all
Mhm.
that, right. It's also there in the various boardrooms of whatever type of corporation or law office or
Mhm.
architectural firm or whatever, right? Contractors' office and
Mhm.
cement layers, etc. Right? I mean, culture
Mhm.
suffuses everything, um, and is dynamic.
Mhm.
Um,
Mhm.
which is why, so yeah, it's one of the things that makes it difficult, to you know uh, uh, fully define, right? Because it's always changing. I mean, cultures
Mhm.
don't, even as we
Mhm.
talk about and people work to, and are in fields that preserve culture, right?
Mhm.
Or preserve the cultural output. Um,
Mhm.
always in relation to the dynamism of it, right? In the way in which
Mhm.
culture changes and cultures interact, which is just always, as long as there have been human groups and
Mhm.
that
Mhm.
identify differently,
Mhm.
different meanings to interact, so to speak, or to find commonalities. So
Mhm.
so at least I take the position. Um, as expressed by Lowe and Loeb. I can't remember their first names. Or is it Loeb and Lowe? I can't remember exactly. Let's get that up. Oh, you put it up there already, huh? Um,
Mhm.
I mean, I could get up and find the book, but I'm not going to. So I'm just going to do it this way, and I hope I have their names in the right order. But I do remember this title, and this is an anthology of essays that the two of them edit.
Mhm.
I do believe I'm getting the name right. Um, but in an essay that they co-write, they talk about the illusion, right,
Mhm.
of separation of spheres.
Mhm.
There's the political, there's the
Mhm.
economic, there's the cultural,
Mhm.
where these are all in dynamic
Mhm.
relation with each other,
Mhm.
right?
Mhm.
Um, and at best, we separate them out just to be able to kind of talk about them in isolation. And
Mhm.
even to talk about them in isolation is to get it wrong, right? Because they're never
Mhm.
in isolation
Mhm.
from each other.
Mhm.
I think Culture in the Shadow of Capitalism, I do believe that is the title. Loeb and Low. Let's see. Yeah, I do. I think I got the name right. Or, if something
Mhm.
close to that. The
Mhm.
um, so that, I just wanted to make that final point,
Mm,
and coming up with a working definition of
mhm,
culture, is that it's there in the political, right? It's there in the economic, and I think that is one of the useful interventions of what might be called the post-structural, um, which is, and the post-structural, I think, is problematic, um, in the way that it's been deployed as a response to Marxism and Marxist ideologies,
mm,
and on the ground, movements for revolutionary change. Um, that, at least nominally wants to offer, an intervention into, in the name of democratic practice,
mm,
within, actually existing socialism,
mhm,
um, but really has been, a useful tool of imperialism to discredit, actually existing efforts at creating, a workers, an economic democracy, right? A socialist world, um, or socialist relations, rather than capitalist relations. However, one thing, one aspect of that post-structuralism, because the structuralism that's being referenced is the Marxist idea of
mhm,
the economic base of society, and
mhm,
then the various structures of,
mhm,
the political structures, economic, etc., structures that up, and
mhm,
then the superstructure on top of that, which is where the realm of culture, what we
mhm,
typically think of as culture, right? Religion,
mhm,
art, education in a way, right? Although, but yeah, the world of ideas, right?
mhm,
But that world of ideas is already implicated within the structure and at the base, right? As just in terms of how the economic, um,
mhm,
unfolds, right? Or what is the practice of the
mhm,
economic, that
mhm,
those practices, and the meaningfulness of the
mhm,
economic activity
mhm,
already implies, culture
mhm,
there, right? Or how, how do folks even name the
mhm,
economic,
mhm,
how do they name the base, right? It's already
mhm,
implies, culture. So the idea, really, again, that, you cannot just put
mhm,
culture up here in the
mhm,
superstructure. You got to recognize that it's already implied at the base, right? And so far as economic activity is meaningful activity. Um, and so that realm of meaning, and what makes
mhm,
everything we do as
mhm,
human beings,
mhm,
our various expressions of humanity around the world, and
mhm,
under imperialist domination, and under whatever folks might think of as freedom, etc.
mhm,
Culture is, it's there, right?
mhm,
We do these things in meaningful ways to us.
mhm,
That's,
mhm.
that's because we are
Creatures of meaning.
acculturated, right?
Mhm,
And again, that notion of a culture as something living and growing.
mhm, mhm, mhm. Yeah, fantastic, fantastic. Really, uh, really enjoy that, um, uh, that metaphor, that culture as living, that description, an explanation of culture as a living thing, right? That, of course, right, is it grows, it reproduces, it changes, it um, on some level can have a death of sorts if it would,
Hmm.
right?
Hmm.
The meanings are lost, when they talk about
Hmm.
dead languages or dead, rituals that cease to be upheld or forgotten,
Hmm. Or
these kind.
become routine, without much meaning anymore.
Say that again.
Or when those rituals become like
Yes.
routine without content. Yes, sir.
without content, which can happen, right, which can happen in a variety of ways.
Mhm.
And what is always interesting to me, because I have, found that this certain articulations and kind of conceptual um, um, conceptual stuff that I think is in that post-structural analysis, in um, to some extent, I guess it is also Marxist analysis. It is in these kinds of things. We begin to describe these kinds of esoteric functions and these kinds of transcendent, if you right, um, dynamics. It's so very akin, particularly when we talk about illusion of separation, right? The illusion of separation and whatnot. It's so akin to um, what's found in other kinds of philosophies, but what we have a whole lot of access to, the Vedantic and the Buddhist and the those particular strains. There's a real kind of um, resonance, in a kind of an immediacy of kind of recognizing that um, thread through of the of this at the point of identity, at the point of embodiment, right, of these different aspects of of illusion, how we embody culture, how these things become um uh uh where as we apply meaning and identify with meaning, how this whole notion of how we become this illusory um construct, and that we're constantly, as long as we are living, as long as we are in the game, in the sphere of consciousness, we are in conversation with this illusion, right? Because we are creatures of, that's what we are. We're creatures of meaning, creatures of the symbolic, right? That stand in, these things that stand in for the reality, because the stand in for some kind of permanence, stand in for some kind of consonance, because of that whole wonderful cliche, um, the only constant is constant is change, and
Mhm.
yet we retain that residue and we retain that sense of continuity, and it's at the center of all these human dramas of loss, right? And the way the sense of loss drives behavior, and right, and the sense of gain, you know, um, and I really appreciate that that's a point of relatability and a kind of a translation of of these concepts. And I think a also an important piece that I want to kind of go to, we were chatting before we came on about um in terms of how these things have evolved, in how these our cultural um baggage, and the question of identity and culture has become such a prominent discussion in the modern world, in the context of white supremacy and quote unquote Western chauvinism, in terms of the Western chauvinism, the way the notions of a superior culture, and everything that that is entailed comes into play. So going into that topic, what would you first discuss or point out about the kind of, the cultural confines of the modern world. Where, where does it hold us? What are some of the
Mhm.
most important streams of meaning?
That is so it isn't new, right? Or sort of the like cultural chauvinism, right? Isn't new. Um, yeah, I know certainly the Romans, thought they were culturally superior to folks. With maybe the exception of the Greeks, who also have a reputation, right, for that sense of,
Hmm.
you know, um, being better than others. I mean, it's not,
Right.
it's
Hmm.
not an unusual thing among
Hmm.
peoples in the world.
Hmm.
Um, that's but all that maybe before the invention of whiteness, or at least whiteness as it's been come to understand, as we've come to understand it, in the modern world, or even the notion of, uh, or the promotion of the idea of the West.
Capital
That,
T,
that
capital
becomes
W.
more than kind of the sort of local, something local to Europe and Western Asia idea of West and East,
Hmm.
that now takes on this extra geographical meaning. Um, and I guess, you ask about identity. I mean, I suppose, a lot of the just discussion around identity, you know, activism around identity, um, contradictions, and even, um, what, I, I don't want to say, well, contradictions within, the working classes of the world, is because of that assertion, right, of Western identity, Western, this promotion of Western civilization, as and Western civilization is kind of a pinnacle of, human
Hmm.
achievement.
Hmm.
At least for the at least since the 1700s, yeah, that folks have been at least started asserting that. I don't know that it was always asserted as such by uh, writers that are considered part of the Western tradition,
Hmm.
thinkers, whatever. The So that kind of pressure, though, that this dividing of the world, um, by Western imperialist or European imperialist, and the Euro satellite countries that emerge around the world, these settler colonies like the United States or
Hmm.
Australia and so many others,
Hmm.
Brazil and so many others, that set themselves up as the pinnacle of civilization, and all these others are barbarians,
Hmm.
savages, uh,
Hmm.
needing to be brought into civilization, right? So the French
Hmm.
have their expressed civilizing project, right? This whole notion, and and what is an aspect of that civilizing project? A major aspect of that civilizing project is the Christianizing of these populations, as Christian becomes synonymous with civilized, and Western, right? Because now Christianity becomes identified with Europe, right? And in a particular way, and in a way that erases its Afro-Asiatic, roots and first 300 years and all that, or even the current presence of, non-Western pre-colonial Christian communities, right, in Africa and Asia. The So it becomes a marker, right, of civilization. Um,
Mhm.
the promotion or even the formulation of a notion of Western civilization and the classics, right? That becomes so fundamental to modern Western identity and the notion of even the ability to say um, for someone to claim Western chauvinism, and then the
Mhm.
rest of us, right,
Mhm.
are confronted then
Mhm.
with notions of, or even have to notions of our own civilization
Mhm.
or lack thereof,
Mhm.
or push to try to understand, well, what is our in the face of this. um at the same time, that this cultural, intellectual, discursive, symbolic world um, is being set up.
Mhm.
It's both reinforcing and is reinforced by the political and economic situation, as these European armies are marching
Mhm.
across our lands, and
Mhm.
I'm meaning globally, right?
Mhm.
With
Mhm.
their missionaries, right?
Mhm.
With their
Mhm.
merchants,
Mhm.
um,
Mhm.
with their missionary schools,
Mhm.
the you know to the present moment, really. And so folks, have to. I mean, I think that's where the concern, or the attention to cultural identity in particular, right? Um, why it becomes
Mhm.
such a stickler, because that identity comes under attack,
Mhm.
um, and even taken for granted, that a taken for granted superiority of so-called
Mhm.
West that is
Mhm.
then in the material world reinforced by political and military dominance, and
Mhm.
um, with the
Mhm.
roots, the bloody roots of
Mhm.
those relations um, submerged.
Mhm. Mhm.
Really,
Steward. Mhm.
yeah, yeah, exactly. The
Mhm.
But I think that's part of where it comes from, and the need to, yeah, the need to protect and reassert one's own humanity, even, right?
Mhm. Mhm.
And and it's we're speaking broadly. I mean, there's a whole range of the folks deigned to say things like Eastern civilization, depending on
Mhm.
where and all that. Well, at the
Mhm.
same time, um, asserting a savagery, right, to
Yeah.
Eastern people.
Mhm.
What they've done to Africa, right?
Mhm.
Anything close to civilization must
Mhm.
have been white people or
Mhm.
Mediterraneans or
Mhm.
Western Asians.
Mhm.
Somebody, it's hard for them to say black
Mhm. Absolutely.
civilization, and that
Well, yeah,
even becomes like an oxymoron
exactly.
in the
Like Black
modern,
thought.
like black thought,
African thought
right?
is a
Right.
yeah,
Um,
absolutely.
but that's why, right? So because of that, people got need to have felt the need to assert that. Are you kidding? Are you,
And
are,
in
and
so
you call
doing,
yourself civilized?
and yeah, and in so doing, in that pushback, because that part of what is like in talking about what is obscured or submerged, right? Um, as a is as a product of that submersion and that obscuring, as a very deliberate process, sometime non-deliberate, just a reproduction
Mhm.
of the culture, and the lens, of that culture as it becomes uh, established in this, uh, becomes what becomes um, sharper and sharper in the view of the notion that there is this ultimate human culture, the notion of the old, and this, of course, is European culture, etc. Um, in itself, inspiring, right, agitating, um, in the minds of we as subject, and um, however many generations removed from various memory,
Mhm.
and uh, various aspects of language, as a conscious practice, where we're seeing our cultural relationships, right? This is what happens in these processes of Christianization and militarization, all these things. And yet out of that, we still pull back the floorboards. We still pull back to begin to piece together histories, to be able to piece together, it's on the presumption, this cannot be so, um, and in fact, go out to and demonstrate, no, this is not so, and begin to repair, right, and um repopulate that memory, yeah, that if it's not maintained through the stories of the jolly, if it's not maintained, through the storytellers of your,
Mhm.
right, of a living tradition that you're able to participate in and identify and what have you, you know how uh um how curtailed is human memory. And really the same is, is so um for the folk, and just looking at kind of that economic part of that economic relationship, is having the resources to reproduce one's cultural self in so many ways, and in so many, right, to expand that, to elaborate on the theme, all of these kinds of things. And and very much exaggerate that sense of presence on the, on the map of human history, the way folks are always reminding themselves. I believe, giving this example, I don't believe it, having seen this, I believe it was, what I do believe, and I'm not sure about, that it may have been uh, a British broadcasting, or maybe it was some Australian journalistic program, right? But they were interviewing um, either a Chinese economist or a Chinese political official, whatnot, at the beginning of this tariff drama and this tariff nonsense. And the Western journalist was trying to push the point that China had to be intimidated by this, had to be. You know what I'm saying? And at a certain point, after, a lot of cool response, well, no, China has this, that, mathematical response, statistics and numbers, the guy actually was kind of visibly agitated. And he said, no, China has been around for millennia before the rise of Europe. And we are sure that we're going to be around for a few millennia more after the fall of the European world. This is not a situation in which we are intimidated. And it was such an interesting psychological drama, right?
Mhm.
Such an interesting, this bursting of this sense, this cultivated sense of bigness, this cultivated, the belief in, the being the pinnacle, the impenetrable, the right,
Mm-hmm.
vulnerable, you know, um, edifice of all that we talk about, the whiteness, the westernness, the all of those, and we all know what those refer to because we're, if for no other reason, because we're members of the culture. So we have a general, we have a generalized sense, and then maybe we have a studied sense. But just kind of bringing that to the foreground, and all of that, you know, um, is to talk about again that importance of um, the importance of cultivating those stories, maintaining those stories, reproducing those stories, where we've had, and within really such a short time frame where with our breakthrough into Black studies and and participating in these universities in that way, and the development of all the other studies, the indigenous studies, the women's studies, the gender studies, and all of these kinds of things in such a relatively short time began to dissolve away. This posed a very serious challenge to those perceived social relations, to those perceived power relations, to those perceived, began to, uh, the clay feet, of the thing begin to dust and sand and erode, um, and part of this culture war that people are so war, part of this reactionary energy that folk are so aware of and have conversation or in conversation about is this this last stand, this um grasping at holding on to that identity at and not minding, I'm going to hold on to this even if I have all I can do to hold on to it is stamp out everything else, because I can't legitimately meet anything in deliberation or argument or debate or compare, or any of that, but I can just by whatever force I have left just stamp out this story and prop up, you know chant our myth. Let's chant our myth. Let's um, drum that up. Um, and so you already have kind of talked about some of those, how those some of those ideas are born and are expanded and begin to
Well,
expand.
let me narrow that down to like a specific case, I guess you might say, that I recall, and this still, and I get, in some ways, this battle is still raging. Um, but I recall in the 1980s, as the various ethnic studies disciplines were, gaining momentum, right? Gaining certain kind of popularity, and I think just popularity among
Hmm.
their indigenous communities, um,
Hmm.
and across those communities, but also um, with emerging generations of Euro descendants,
Hmm.
um, and still certainly coming out of the unrest and challenges of the 60s and 70s, right? Still in the 80s. And so, there was a push in California. I don't think only in California, but in California for sure, there was a push to the language used at the time, at least some language used at the time, wanted to pick up on the civil rights language of desegregation or integration, right? and talked about integrating the curriculum.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
You know, if you remember that phrasing, right? Integrating
Curriculum
the
of
curriculum.
inclusion. Mm-hmm.
Yes.
Mm-hmm.
And so, and one thought was, at least at the college level, I think at the high school level also,
Mm-hmm.
um, but at the college level, I remember this argument about making an ethnic studies course a requirement, right? Just one ethnic studies course,
Mm-hmm.
a requirement. And and I recall, you know, the what was deployed as a response of how this would be, you know, could be the death knell of Western civilization if students had to take one ethnic studies course of their choosing. Um,
Wow.
well, you know, what is that going? What course is that going to replace?
Mm-hmm.
The students would miss out on Shakespeare,
Mm-hmm.
and that would be, you know, that not taking a Shakespeare class so that they could take an ethnic studies class would be
Mm-hmm.
like an irreparable loss to the
Mm-hmm.
civilization and its ability to reproduce itself.
Mm-hmm.
Now, I think at that time, up to this day,
Mm-hmm.
Shakespeare's reputation
Mm-hmm.
and is and place in the canon,
Mm-hmm.
certainly of English language,
Mm-hmm.
poetry, and drama,
Mm-hmm.
drama broadly speaking, you know, etc., is fine, right? But
Mm-hmm.
this was what was deployed, right? That, you know, how dare you recommend, and then we might have to give up, you know, one of the leading lights, right, of Western civilization, which is to say civilization. Um, and that was a step too far.
Mm-hmm.
And so much of what animates, you know, the attack on education now, right? And there's a lot of, you know, general talk
Mm-hmm.
about you know, an attack on academic freedom, which is accurate.
Mm-hmm.
But a lot of the academic freedom that is
Mm-hmm.
under attack is the is the freedom to tell these other stories, right? The
Absolutely.
freedom to tell the you know, the African story
Yes.
without filter, or the indigenous story without filter, or the Palestinian story without filter, right? Or even to tell the European story
Yes.
with all of its contradictions,
Yes.
um, because there is no one
Mm-hmm.
Western culture, right?
Mm-hmm.
As you know, they are very quick to distinguish among themselves. Right?
Absolutely.
They're quite different, you know, between, say, being Southern European or Eastern European or Northern European, and
Mm-hmm.
etc. Right?
Mm-hmm.
Um,
Mm-hmm.
and the ways in which all of us, right? Of course, this is, you
Mm-hmm.
know, one of the things these studies allow us to do is not
Mm-hmm.
just explore the processes that bring us to where we are now, the ways in which, you know, we have deployed culture as resistance, as survival, um, expanded, you know,
Mm-hmm.
culture.
Mm-hmm.
Again, you know, that 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 notion of a living and growing entity. The
Mm-hmm.
It also, you know, looks at the diversity within
Mm-hmm.
cultures, right? And or
Mm-hmm.
within these, you know, diasporic communities, and
Yes.
um, you know, what all the various peoples that fall under the various, you know, labels and categories and identifications, right? And I mean, you know, one can take a class in Eastern philosophy, but and what one is going to learn is that,
Mm-hmm.
you know, Taoism is not, you know, Jainism, right? And
Mm-hmm.
the
Right.
other, you know,
Right.
you know, and that the Tao Te Ching is not the Upanishads, right? I mean,
Right.
and I'm leaving other folks out, right?
Of course, it's
Of
impossible
the
not right. Right.
the focus on really, and the focus on the literary, right? So the privileging
Yes.
of the literary
Yes.
in these spaces also,
Yes. Yeah.
um, and that notion of the construction of these disciplines in the academy, at their root, thinking and working beyond the academy, right? But being connected to the communities that produce the students. Um, and indeed, that being kind of like part of the counterinsurgency, um, is to kind of sever that tie, right? To sort of ghettoize these disciplines in the academy, and uh,
Mm,
to alienate them
mhm,
the from the
mm,
communities
mhm,
they discuss, right?
mm,
And to alienate working class
mhm,
students, right? Working class
mhm,
students from whatever background, from their working class communities.
mhm,
Um,
mhm, mhm.
so culture, right? So when we're talking about these cultural structures, right? These uh, they are reinforced. I mean, and that's the idea of the superstructure, right? That it
Mhm,
ends up being a reinforcement, right? Through symbolism,
mhm,
the
mhm,
creation of meaning, etc., of the status quo, right? Of the economic
mhm.
relations as they exist. Um, Except they always are existing. There's always dominant, and there are always these sectors that are oppositional, or just sort of de- developing, cultivating, in a parallel and oppositional or indifferent
Right.
path, right? And
Right. Any imaginable juxtaposition, because that's the
any imaginable
nature.
juxtaposition.
That is the nature. Diversity is the rule, and divergence is the rule, and
Hmm.
recombination and hybridization and all of these kinds of dynamics
Hmm.
are the rule,
Right.
even as we, um, even as we uh, feel or exist in some kind of an identify with, it's probably the best term, um, and are always in the danger of becoming a word I'm hearing a lot lately, calcified in um, our sense of our own cultural moment and the sense of its permanence, right? Perhaps because we're swimming in it. It's kind of like as far as the eye can see, as far as the memory, unextended through study, right? Unextended through study and uh, then cultural comparisons and interaction and all of that sort of thing is right. Just whatever it is I have been told or been able to pick up, kind of along the way. That I was talking about these things that give us this reinforce in our very localized levels this sense of a false sense, that illusion of substance, a false sense of permanence of our of our cultural situations, of our cultural situation, and it's a function of so much a function of memory. um One little, and talk about a micro study, teeny itty bitty case study that I'm able to witness in my 57 years. So think about that in terms of 47 years of, kind of memory accumulation, as a member of a culture, the way, at this time, um, we can witness, people in our age brackets can witness the what's called the appropriation, the um, passing of our cultural norms into mainstream and other cultural, communities and discourse and, language that we would what I some of the stuff I always talk about, hearing the term booty used in commercial television, like, booty and bougie, used in commercial television as if, as if it's, some naturally occurring language feature of, of white bourgeois, American white bourgeois society or something. Anyway, there's a number of little things, like that, and I'm also able to witness that, the kids I work with every day, the Black kids I work with every day, don't necessarily remember a time when certain language was very specifically Black language, and Black referent language, So all of this with culture changing, I don't want to get away tonight without hearing you talk a bit about something else you've studied closely, the feminist expression, the right these notions of well, why don't you talk about what the notions of feminism are, and put some kind of context with that, because that's certainly a target, another target of the reactionary right pushback in terms of culture, trying to
Well,
reharness
that's an
culture.
interesting. I mean, I don't know that you know how many different feminisms are there, right? And even the the intervention of Africana womanism as a response to bourgeois white bourgeois feminism. Um, but I guess one could say at its root and in the tradition of the assertion of individual rights, right, in that liberal discourse of the individual. Um, Although I have seen it, I have seen at least one argument of sort of a Marxist feminism that redefines women as a particular class, right, as a social class. Um, but the insight, right, that I think uh, a feminist lens brings to this conversation on culture is the insight of that phrase or that truism: the personal is political, and the way in which, right, are whatever the public proclamations of our politics um, fundamentally, right, is about human relation and relations of power, right, primarily. And if one is not even aware of the power dynamic within like the most interpersonal of relationships, um, how substantive can the external revolution be, so to speak, right?
Hmm.
A friend of mine, indeed, I'm being polite, right? My girlfriend, back in college, um,
Hmm.
would often talk about her father and her brother, who could be described as revolutionaries, both artists. And but she was but they're quite traditional around the home, right, in terms of gender roles. Um, and that's really the challenge, right? So and and the challenge of feminism, and that challenge that has evoked such reaction, because it has dared to look beyond, the or through the romanticized language around the family, right? The sacralized language around the family, um, and borrowing from Marxism, borrowing from the social sciences, right? From uh, sociology, psychoanalysis, um, anthropology, right?
Mhm.
The
Mhm. Mhm.
understanding, taking or at least looking in, making the effort to understand, the economics of marriage and family, right?
Mhm.
And um, the political structure within family, and even the recognition of the like every other human activity, the diversity of family, and even the dynamism of family as the form has changed and the definition has changed again over time. What is generally meant by that word family, coming into English from the Latin, and whatever its equivalents are, around the world. Um, and so bringing the revolution, right, in the sense, whether the bourgeois revolution, the proletarian revolution,
Hmm.
however we want to understand it, right? The struggle for national liberation, um, into the family, right? And so challenging some of the most
Mhm.
basic structures of the society, as this again, as the society sees itself, right? What is
Mhm.
that language? Sort of the ego ideal of the
Mhm.
society,
Mhm.
which may or may not
Mhm.
have anything to do with the reality,
Reality of. Mhm.
right? Or may, some version of a reality somewhere that's idealized, um, right? The
Mhm.
So that in particular, right? The
Mhm.
notion that women don't have to be baby machines, right? And of
Mhm.
course, this is attractive to traditionalists across civilizational complexes, right?
Mhm.
Um, even in, where there is a tradition, and not just a tradition, right, but a well established practice of,
Mhm.
more of what we might call female empowerment,
Mhm.
or gender egalitarianism.
Mhm.
Um,
Mhm.
even within those structures, right?
Mhm.
Um, or those places,
Mhm.
there's and certainly the both Christianizing or Islamicizing, or
Mhm.
maybe I can even say Judaizing, of
Mhm.
various places through Christianity and
Mhm.
or Islam, reinforces that new political order in the family, right? In
Mhm.
various places. Um,
Mhm.
you know, that I think, that insight, um, that intervention of feminism, or what people generally think of as feminism or womanism, um, that if you are committed to freedom, and equality, then that has to mean all of us, regardless of our anatomies,
Mhm.
or self identifications,
Mhm.
regardless of anatomy,
Mhm.
which again is problematic for people, um,
Mhm.
for some of the same
Mhm.
reasons, right? Because it
Mhm.
it
Mhm.
fundamentally
Mhm.
disrupts, the received notions of gender roles, and
Mhm.
um, and particularly in this society where there is such
Mhm.
a binary, and we know that's not
Yes,
universal,
it's not.
but
Mhm.
it is also right now ascendant, or
Mhm.
continues at
Mhm.
least in the moment to be ascendant.
Pervasive. Right.
Yeah.
Mhm. Mhm.
Um, Despite its own history of uh, fluidity, right?
Mhm.
And
Mhm.
histories, and even biblical histories that could probably be pointed out of fluidity when you
Mhm.
talk to scholars, right, and whatnot.
Mhm.
So,
Mhm. Mhm.
so anyway, I think in terms of feminism, though, I think it's and why it's been as a area of thought and discourse and action and activism has been so important, is because it does raise those questions of how um, the most intimate of our relationships
Mhm.
um,
Mhm.
can either reinforce
Yes.
or the way in which we live with contradiction, right?
Mhm.
One of the ways in which we live with contradiction, um, that and contradictions can be resolved, right? But first, one has to be aware of the contradiction.
Mhm.
Um, and so much of this, so referring to our title for the evening, and as you mentioned, this is likely, if we do what we do, this is likely to be a
Mhm.
multiple session
Mhm.
conversation. Um,
Mhm.
but per our title, Christian nationalism, reaction, and culture. I mean, so much of what's being reacted to,
Mhm.
and this
Mhm.
this reaction
Mhm.
being expressed through various traditionalisms, including this notion of Christian nationalism or just fundamentalisms and the
Mhm.
various types of fundamentalisms and cultural
Yes.
nationalisms, even.
Mhm.
Um, Feminism upsets that, right?
Mhm.
And feminism, and it's read as
Mhm.
a particular attack on notions of masculinity and the
Mhm.
role of man and the placement of the man. And I know,
Mhm.
and two things can be true at once, right? And in fact, more than two things can be true at once. There's been a lot of talk, and you've been, of late, and particularly in the wake of the recent U.S. presidential election, about the crisis of masculinity.
Mhm.
And
It's
that
all over the place.
and it's likely accurate, right? And part of that crisis,
Mhm.
though, has been the resistance to the insights and interventions of feminism, um, the reaction to it, and instead of the willingness to take it on its own terms and self-reflect and all that. Although at the same time, again, don't want to overstate it, right? Because just like with this previous election, there was no mandate.
Yes.
The current
Yes.
president won by a plurality of
Yes.
1.5%.
Yes. Mhm.
Um, there was a recent poll. I think Axios might have done the poll. Do you think Donald Trump is a dangerous dictator?
Mhm.
Um, Now, the majority of people in the United States said yes.
Mhm.
Then they broke it down ethnically.
Mhm.
Um, the lowest group, right? The lowest number of people ethnically or
Mhm.
racially
Mhm.
are white folks. Do you
Mhm.
think Donald Trump is a dictator?
Mhm.
45%. So that's less than half, but that's
Mhm.
almost half, right?
Yeah.
And it's
Yeah.
about the number of people that, it about matches the election and,
Yeah. And it's not
sort of,
70. It's not a
and it's
mandate.
not 70 exactly.
Mhm.
It's not even 51.
Which in just to insert, hold your
Mhm.
thought, and I won't take long. Just looking at this real kind of whatever real is, but kind of volatility of the what ego ideal. Did you refer to it? Is that
Mhm.
the language? The ego ideal in of for American culture, and I'm not trying
Mhm.
to speak
Mm-hmm.
to what's going on in other, you know, other Western countries and whatnot. Though I know, you know, I'm just talking about you know what we look at here because there is this kind of um, you know, we I think stand largely unaware of also how deep that influences our ego ideal. There's an ego ideal in America, the that's not who we are
Right.
discourse
Yeah.
that
Mm-hmm.
where we now begin to identify as non-racist, as non-sexist. We are the
Mm-hmm.
society of progressive values. We are the, you know what I'm saying? And so this memory, again, our well, ego ideal, our memory of ourselves as being you know what has been produced in the last what 90 years kind of were the fruit of that social movement, or 70 years, that social those social movements and the movement of those ideas and the way that you know uh the 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 media created, well, yeah, or had to absorb and react, and maybe you'll comment on that, had to absorb and react to what was happening spontaneously on the ground, and had to, you know, perhaps mirror, you know, some of that to regain the narrative or kind of, you know, get back on that narrative horse. But yeah, there's a change in perhaps in that ego ideal deal where there is a, you know, folk aren't let's say, well, let's look at the demographic. um White men are not so uh terrified. You know what I'm saying? Crisis notwithstanding, because you can hear a crisis, a conversation about male crisis and what is it to be a man and how to reclaim your manhood and what, and across, you know, across demographics. But anyway, you hear what I'm saying? There's a way in which there's another projection of the American self, the American identity or whatnot, that may not be firmly rooted or established in kind of you know, understanding of these thought processes that lead to these conclusions, but is a kind of ideal and a comfort zone. You know what I'm saying? That would at least take time to reroute into, you know, would take time to reroute into a sense of fearfulness, into a sense of, you know, all these things. But yeah, and all also I want to throw in, not all crisis is bad crisis. Crisis is not always, you know, crisis is always happening. Identity crisis is always happening if you're moving through the world and meeting change and meeting difference.
Right. Well, I think that's the point I was getting to,
Mm.
or part of the point, right? That um, there are, you know, the interventions of feminism since the late 1960s, right? Or if not before, you know, it's having effect, right? I mean, there are, you know, whatever is going on in the manosphere online, whatever the um, whatever is going on with the so-called incels or self-described incels, right?
Mhm.
Involuntary celibates.
Mhm.
Um,
Mhm.
you know, young men's and you know younger men's and at least men of my generation, right? Because I you know I was a child during the what then was called the women's liberation movement, right, in the late 60s, and the period when women were burning their bras and this sort of thing, right? And you know the pop culture reflects it, right? And the pop culture has been reflecting it. Um, battle of the sexes episodes, right? With on the Brady Bunch, for example, the boys versus the girls type thing. And so for a very long time, right, the pop culture has been addressing it and generally coming down on the side of, women can do whatever men can do, more or less, right? Um, or the stupidness, right? The backwardness of holding on to these old fashioned ideas, generally speaking. But then that's also the thing that makes the popular culture um, capitalist, imperialist, reinforcing as it may be, um, a target, right? Because it's willingness to accommodate, right, certain of these social changes, like women in uh, presenting women as equals, or in charge of their own sexuality,
Mhm.
various TV shows or what have you, right? Or going back to the what was it, the 92 election, or yeah, well, the period of the early 90s, the whole upset over whether this fictional character Murphy Brown should be a
Mhm.
single mother or not, right?
Mm.
Sort of thing, right? That had a
Mhm.
whole bunch of people in a kerfuffle, right?
Mhm.
The, but that's what's being pushed back against, right? Because
Mhm.
that has had some effect.
Mhm.
There is a long, now decades long tradition of men, um, and maybe this might particularly be the case among college educated men, although I still wouldn't want to overstate it. Um,
Mhm.
Becoming familiar, right, with some of the interventions and ideas of feminism, and um, trying to be, self-reflective
Mhm.
on what is, how does male privilege play out,
Mhm.
etc. Um,
Mhm.
and all the things we know, though, right? All Black people in a white supremacist structure may be oppressed, but
Mhm.
we aren't all oppressed necessarily in the same way,
Mhm.
right?
Mhm.
All women may be oppressed in a patriarchal society, but
Mhm.
not to the same degree or in the same way.
Mhm.
And as we have seen again in the last three elections for president,
Mhm.
women who are willing to vote for
Mhm.
uh, confessed
Mhm.
and adjudicated, right, sexual assaulters,
Yes.
um, as when
Mhm.
they weigh their interest, whatever they think their interests are, right? And again, is it, maybe the white is stronger than the woman, as the case might be, or for some,
Mhm.
the man part is more important than the Black part, right?
Mhm.
Although I still don't want to overstate that, because all they needed to
Mhm.
do was peel off a few, right?
Right.
Which was all, because which was all they needed, when it was the point,
Yeah.
just peel off a few,
Yeah.
uh, and peel off a few of all of that
Yes.
traditional, and discourage the rest.
Mhm.
And well, either way,
Mhm.
so uh, to try to bring it back around, right? That is exactly what is being pushed against. This kind of rapid change to the culture over this last 90, 70, 60,
Mhm.
50 years, right?
Mhm.
Um, because actually, I heard something very interesting today, or maybe it was yesterday, and this was actually on the Majority Report. A reference was being made to the American Dream, and somebody, pushing back on the American Dream, or referencing the American Dream. And so the folks on the Majority Report gave the original quote for the American Dream, which is not, and it ends up being nothing like what we ordinarily think of as the American dream, right? That it doesn't have to have anything to do with sort of material gain or anything like that, but much more about self-actualization, right? And being able to
Mhm.
achieve,
Mhm.
live with dignity and
Mhm.
develop yourself.
Mhm.
But and the point was made, and this was 1931, that that the person that was being quoted didn't say every man should be able
Mhm.
to, but very specifically said every man and woman should be able to such and such, right?
Mhm.
So there's already notions, right, coming out, even coming out of the 19th century, right, of
Mhm.
that this if humans are equal, all humans are equal. Yeah, I didn't. Um,
Mhm.
and that slow
Mhm.
struggle that brings us to this point, right, where still people aren't believing everybody's equal or the
Mm-mm.
same,
Mm-mm.
or all that,
Yeah.
um, and are sacralizing their their racism, their
Mhm.
classism, their
Mhm.
sexism, and etc. Right, they're
Mhm.
barely beneath the surface
Mhm.
eugenicist beliefs.
Absolutely. Mhm.
The
Mhm.
and that and so a word that was used earlier, um, cultivate.
Mhm.
Again, at that root and getting to that idea of the living and growing thing,
Mhm.
and these forces of reaction, at least since the 1950s, certainly since the 1950s, with the official desegregation order of schools, right, and Brown versus the Board of Education, um, have worked hard, right, to cultivate a social and cultural atmosphere for their
Mhm.
children,
Mhm.
generations now, right,
Mhm.
to continue to
Mhm.
preserve
Mhm.
and promote these
Mhm.
retrograde ideas,
Mhm.
the racist ideas,
Mhm.
the the sexist ideas, these
Mhm.
tradition, these notions of tradition.
Mhm.
Again, tradition that may be no
Mhm.
older than the 20th century itself, but
Mhm.
it doesn't matter.
Mhm.
And then that being, and then creating an entire
Mhm.
infrastructure, right, for that,
Mhm.
right?
Mhm.
Their own sets of films and filmmaking,
Absolutely.
radio,
Literature,
television, etc. Right,
everything.
while at the same
Yes.
time very actively and publicly condemning the general
Right.
society where
Mhm.
these changes are taking place that they have now
Yes.
um,
Yes.
determined are so dangerous
Yes.
to their way of life, to what
It's
makes the world meaningful, uh, to what the
beautifully
world
said, very
needs.
eloquent. Yes, so eloquent, from where you started your conversation. Um, and also not a new, not it's the same. It's the
Mhm.
same cry, that same cry, that always surfaces for of the protection of, um, civilization, comma, Western, you know?
Mhm.
Um,
Mhm.
and all the this breaks down the family, and you can't have civilization without in this family. Nuclear family is the cornerstone of
Right.
civilization. You can't have all these things resolve back to that. Even the uh, something that comes to my mind often, and I'll have to learn the name of this person who I believe was he may have been a governor, or he may have just been a political official, or he may have just been a uh, personality, a respected figure in the uh, drive to preserve white supremacy. But that kind of iconic speech, of the man at the podium And he was like, the you know, he was all about us. Well, it's not the segregation today, tomorrow, and forever. It's the one where the person says the mixing of the races or desegregation is and so forth will create a mongrel race, right?
Yes,
A
yes,
mongrel race of, in terms of that same, it's the same projection and that same sensibility of about miscegenation, right?
yeah.
That is projected on to, the well, very specifically pointed toward the trans community, this tiny sliver of a group of people that
Hmm.
is right engaged is blown up in this imagination, in this bubble, right? To, to contribute to the mongrelization that will bring down, both races. And you know what I'm saying?
Yeah.
Very passionate, very heartfelt, very, very much believed. And, when I have conversations with, my fellow Afro descendant people, had a conversation today with someone about Afro descendant, African descendant, right? But with my fellow Africans from here, um, about, that nudge, nudge, wink, wink. Yeah, but that's them. That's not us. But what about this trans stuff? And they, begin to circulate and share, some of these. Some of these tropes, some of these notions, some of, and one of the things that I converse with is, that, our the view toward Africans in this society, and the enslaved African has not been different in terms of the notion of us as uh uh an abomination, as abominable, you know. Never mind the sexual relations, and never mind that, because people will screw goats. So that's not evidence of human recognition of someone's humanity, or perception of someone's humanity. um but that, and I like your terminology, um the terminology that I've heard you use, that I believe is your terminology. um it is not homophobia but homo odium, you know
Hmm.
this sense of disgust, this sense of repulsion, this sense of, right.
Hmm.
And so, yeah, I like to bring us to that recognition. When we say that, this is not the same, and they try to say it's the same thing as, essentially, anti-black racism. It's the same thing as, and it's like, well, let's look at the ways that it's the same. The way that it's the same in terms of that imagination. But yeah, the capacity to um, for spectacle, the capacity to create these, make the huge, make huge anything, whatever its actual size, to make huge, dramatic, emotional, pressuring, all of these things through, control of, um, I guess that which resources and tells the story, that which mediates the story through media. Yeah, I'm trying not to say media.
But that's it. That how can you avoid it though?
Can
Because
you not?
that is
Yeah,
the
how can you
media,
not?
right?
And you
That
broaden
is
the,
the go between.
and right, and also in the same way that we broaden or look at the actual broadness of the depth of the world, the word culture, and that, as a meaning environment, then yeah, there's all kinds of mechanism of mediation of the culture, some unintentional, some, that weren't even constructed to mediate and relay the story. Um, yeah, that part, that part.
Um, the another phrase I like to use on that point, and sort of Marxian, I guess you might say, in its origin. Instead of talking about, who owns the means of production, um, but specifically in that area of media and distribution, right, of the story, and who owns the means of representation. And of course, that's tied into that to the means, or the means of representational production. Um,
Mhm,
so critical to that, right, and the ability to blast the story, right,
mhm,
and suffuse the environment with
mhm,
various versions and forms, of the story, including that area of media that we don't necessarily think of as mediation, uh,
mhm,
but the textbook, right? The textbooks, yeah, just that, right? Text,
mhm,
school books, um,
mhm,
which again is why, through the efforts for educational reform,
uh,
and even the daring to think revolutionary in a revolutionary manner regarding education, the use of educational theorists like Paulo Freire becoming fairly common, right? At least
mhm,
in some
mhm,
teacher preparation programs and
mhm,
graduate programs.
mhm, mhm,
I know in my graduate journey, I think the book was his Pedagogy of the Oppressed, I
mhm,
believe, was assigned 3 times in 3 separate classes, right?
mhm,
Myself, one in composition studies, one in education classes, and then in cultural studies class, right, on human rights. The Or writers like Henry Giroux,
mhm,
even, well, what's his name, Mike Rose, right? Folks. So there's a long tradition, right? Along with the emergence of the ethnic studies, women's studies,
mhm,
queer studies,
mhm,
labor
mhm,
studies, right? These
mhm,
areas for academic research
mhm,
into the workers of the world,
mhm,
really. Um, so hence the reaction, right? Hence the pushback, and the efforts to purge textbooks, because it's taken that long to even have a chance to have other parts of the story told.
mhm,
A chance for a book like um,
mhm,
Howard Zinn's A People's History of the United States
mhm,
to even get popular, right? And
mhm,
you know um, that they're now pushing back against, right? Because
mhm.
it does matter, and those inroads do make a difference.
Absolutely.
And so, and they are making a difference.
Absolutely.
And even if people don't completely know yet how to unlearn
Mhm,
racism,
mhm,
how to unlearn
mhm,
colonialism,
mhm,
and imperialist attitudes,
mhm,
how to unlearn sexism,
mhm, mhm,
how to try to avoid creating new generations that have to unlearn it, right?
mhm,
Um, all those efforts, that's what is posing a danger, or this is the source of the reaction, right? They don't want
mhm,
to unlearn that, and so that's
mhm,
that. is an attack
Mhm.
on notions of Western civilization,
Mhm.
or whatever other
Mhm.
orthodoxy folks are
Mhm.
trying to
Mhm.
assert, um,
Mhm.
and
Mhm.
replace, right? Replace
Mhm.
this infrastructure that's already been created, right? And
Mhm.
kind of,
Mhm.
generalize it. They're hoping this current crop, they're hoping to make that the
Yes.
popular culture, right?
Yes.
All
Yes.
they're going to do is,
It's
drive
very hard.
culture underground. I mean, the people ain't.
Yes.
But
No.
anyway, we're
No.
coming up on one. We're at 140.
We are at one. Yes. We are at
Um,
140.
so we
Mhm.
can start winding it down, and we know we'll pick
Uh-huh.
it back up.
Uh-huh.
But we can start looking at, we can start looking at some of this cultural cultural product
Yes.
maybe coming up, in cultural, well, yeah, cultural product, various forms of cultural product that we can start looking
Yes.
at, and some of the areas of,
Yes.
some curious areas of cultural production, um, that might even be trying to have it both ways, right? Uh, asserting sort of safe bourgeois notions of society, while at the
Yes.
same time making space, trying to
Yes.
make some kind of space. And we might say, what's the word? Not assimilate.
Mhm.
Um, oh, the word's right on the tip of my tongue, and I can't quite bring it. I can't get, so I'll just say to domesticate some of
Mhm.
these.
Mhm.
Some of these insurgent
Mhm.
tendencies. So I'm thinking right now, like specifically of a group of channels, the Hallmark channels,
Mhm.
on cable, and they got
Mhm.
multiple, right, Hallmark channels, but there are some
Mhm.
common features, um, where you're barely going to see anything looking like class contradictions, even though there might be some clear class distinctions. There ain't going to be no real class contradictions. Everything looks nice and clean and shiny, polished. Um, but they are willing to, um, for example, write interracial
Right.
romantic
Right.
rom-coms, kind of, right, made for
Right.
television,
Right.
which might seem like nothing, but it isn't no thing when you consider,
Mhm. Yes.
the relative
Yes.
bent of a
Yes.
Hallmark movie, right? And
Right.
that any conservative should be happy
Right.
with, or any liberal Democrat could be happy with. So
Right.
it's an interesting, just
Right.
and actually it has me wondering, because we know now that these folks are feeling ascendant, they've been quite open about, their opposition to interracial marriage, and the concern about, the concern about birth rate, but we know this is
Natalism. Yeah.
white birth
What
rate is the
that
real issue,
means. Yeah.
right?
It's not in a distant past.
It's not in
The
the distant.
rhetoric, it's the past of it is not distant. It's only distant relative to how uh uh big we feel in the new quote unquote ethic, in the new
Mhm,
dimension of plurality, which is, I
mhm,
think that it has, I think for a number of reasons, really, um, that again, that volatility of the ego ideal, of the culture, I think that it as hard to displace as that real time learned reality of, say, yeah, I actually have quite a few friends that are not part of my ethnic group. I have, what I mean, have access to them, the realities, of de jure uh, integration of public space. Not talking about the in fact, that populations are still quite uh, distant from each other, there is a sensibility through the mediation and through some of these the areas, the zones of confluence, in the unsegregated society, where folks have unlearned a certain level of, there can still be agitation and annoyance and these kinds of things, but it's the intensity and the foreign sense of foreignness has been depleted. Yes, but I do think that um, they can give a good run for the money, because folks don't have, you know, I could see people be convinced under circumstances, for instance, of, as you hear more and more in the language, um, the term American experiment, the democratic experiment, this which is a very different uh, uh, tone, you know what I'm saying, than this kind of real sense of the firmness of and the enduring nature of America as a democracy, a democratic, nation, culture, and the biggest never mind whether that's an accuracy or not. There is an ideal that ego ideal that's being subtly challenged, in various ways. So um I wonder, you know um how what the challenges will be and what the challenges won't be in trying to whitewash and trying to re um reseed that not too distant past, not too distant apartheid past in this country. Um, but all that being said, 846, I do look forward to venturing into these, what is it? These case studies and looking at some of these products, and um, also hopefully you will talk about uh, your work, your examinations of the counterinsurgencies in specifically the black of toward the black revolutionary and uh, uh, black radical um, trends and energies, right? Um, that were presented, in the media, in these ways of capturing and containing that very potent force that we've generated and that you've evaluated and studied and looked at. So
we'll pick it up
that.
there.
Mm-hmm.
Pick it up there next week, looking at, again, some specific culture, some productions, right? Some products of the culture, which culture, right? This imperialist culture, right? This settler colonial culture that doesn't even necessarily, remember its process of colonization, even as it yearly celebrates it in various ways.
Mm-hmm.
Uh, and yet the processes become invisibilized. So yeah, we can look at, because there are quite a few things, the other things we haven't touched on yet,
Yeah.
but we've touched on in the past, right? This promotion of a techno feudalism,
Mm-hmm.
and just that, right? This
Mm-hmm.
out romanticizing, or at least the emergence of the feudal, right? The in popular culture,
Mm-hmm.
popular culture
Mm-hmm.
stories, etc. And what
Mm-hmm.
I heard, there's a particular there's a particular fast food joint, right, whose um, signature character, in fact, it's named after him, is a clown, right? Not a
Yes.
clown that wears yellow, though, but
Okay.
another clown
Another one.
who happened to mention on one of the commercials the other this character happened to mention
Mm,
something to the effect of
mm,
you know, how should I what how does he phrase it? Something along the lines of, hearing a lot more country music these days, something like that, or isn't country great, or something to that fact, right?
mhm,
So
mhm.
the popular culture, including the culture of advertising, right, trying
Yes.
to express something or shape something
Mhm.
in the cultural moment, right? Um,
For
as
next week.
as
It's beginning to bloom. Yeah.
we've made this turn, right? So yes, so we can look at some specific cultural expressions of what is attempting to be cultivated. Um, a new golden age of
Mm,
America.
mm.
Well, thank you, Tasha. Um,
Thank you, Yusuf.
so let's say good night.
Good night.
Good night, y'all. What are the magic words? Don't forget
Like,
to subscribe, like,
subscribe, like, and share.
and share. Please subscribe, like, and share. Share with all your friends. And the
And we're gonna,
conversation on culture will continue.
and we're gonna add comment. Join.
Yes.
Join the Joko conversation.
Join the Joko conversation. Yes. Got to
Either
go back and see if
during or
anybody
after.
commented last week. Let me
Hopefully.
confess, I haven't even looked to check.
Right, I know. Me neither. I'm
Right?
just assuming.
So let's find out if somebody did. Anyway, yes, that's great. That's
Yes.
a great exhortation. Yes. Along with your subscribing, liking, and sharing, do please come.
Yes. Yes.
All right, y'all. We will see you in a week.